My name is Odelia Harrow, and I am 69 years old. These hands, gnarled and scarred, have picked cotton under the merciless Georgia sun for more years than most people live. These eyes have witnessed cruelties that would break the spirits of those who believe themselves strong. This body, bent but not broken, carries the weight of a lifetime spent in chains. Some visible, others wrapped so tightly around my soul that I wondered if I would ever breathe free. It was the spring of 1863 when everything changed. The war between the states raged beyond the boundaries of Thornfield Plantation. But within these gates, Master Edmund Thornfield ruled as if he were God himself. The rumors of freedom rode on every wind, whispered in the quarters after dark, sung in coded spirituals as we worked the fields. But Master Edmund laughed at such talk. He stood on his columned porch, bourbon in hand, and declared that his property would remain his property until the day he died. I had been born on this land. My mother had died in these fields when I was 7, her heart simply giving out under the strain of endless labor and heartbreak. My father had been sold away before I could remember his face. I had raised children who were not mine, loved them as my own, only to watch them torn from my arms and sold to distant plantations. I had buried friends, endured the lash, survived fevers and deprivations that killed stronger people than me. But I had also learned. I had watched. I had listened. The big house held secrets that Master Edmund and his pale-faced wife never imagined a servant could comprehend. They spoke freely in front of us, as if we were furniture, incapable of thought or memory. I learned which roots in the garden could heal and which could harm. I learned which mushrooms grew in the dark woods beyond the tobacco fields. Old Sarah, who had tended the sick before she passed 5 winters ago, had taught me things that the white folks called superstition, but that I knew to be ancient knowledge passed down through generations. The morning it all began was unremarkable. The April air hung thick with moisture, promising rain that would not come. I rose before dawn, as I had for 69 years, my joints protesting each movement. The sleeping quarters smelled of too many bodies in too small a space, of exhaustion and despair that had seeped into the very wood of the walls. I wrapped my headscarf carefully, hiding the gray hair that Master Edmund said made me look like a witch. He did not like to be reminded that his property aged, that we were human enough to grow old. In the kitchen house, I began preparations for the day's meals. Young Ruth, barely 16, helped me stoke the fire in the great hearth. Her hands trembled as she worked. The night before, Master Edmund's son, Thomas, had cornered her in the pantry. I had heard her crying afterward, had held her while she sobbed into my shoulder. There was nothing I could do. There was never anything we could do. "Miss Odelia," Ruth whispered as she handed me the basket of eggs, "do you think the Yankees will really come? Do you think we'll really be free?" I looked at her young face, still holding on to hope that I had lost decades ago. "Keep your voice down, child," I cautioned, though my own heart beat faster at the thought. Freedom. The word itself felt foreign in my mouth, like a language I had never been taught to speak. The morning passed in the familiar rhythm of labor. I prepared Master Edmund's breakfast. Eggs coddled in cream, ham sliced thick, biscuits light as air. I knew his preferences better than I knew my own. I had spent 40 years serving at his table, anticipating his needs before he spoke them, becoming invisible in my efficiency. It was midday when the incident occurred that would change everything. Master Edmund had returned from town, his mood foul. The war news was not favorable to the Confederacy. Sherman's armies were cutting through the South like a scythe through wheat. The certainty that had always marked Master Edmund's bearing had developed cracks. I was clearing the lunch dishes when he called for more wine. His voice was sharp, impatient. I moved as quickly as my old bones would allow, but it was not fast enough. The crystal decanter slipped in my hands made clumsy by arthritis and exhaustion, and shattered on the imported Italian tile. The sound seemed to echo through the dining room like a gunshot. Red wine spread across the floor like blood. Master Edmund's face turned the color of a bruise. "You worthless creature!" he roared, rising from his chair. 69 years old, and you cannot perform the simplest task. That decanter was worth more than you'll ever be. I stood frozen, glass shards glittering at my feet like stars in a malevolent sky. I had learned long ago not to speak when he was in such rages, not to meet his eyes, not to show any emotion that might stoke his fury higher. But he was not finished. He stepped closer, his breath hot with bourbon and rage. "You are nothing, Odelia. Do you understand me? Nothing. You're just a servant. Less than that. You're property. You exist to serve, and you cannot even do that properly." The words struck deeper than any lash ever had, not because they were new. I had heard variations of this speech my entire life, but because in that moment, something inside me shifted. I felt it physically, like a bone setting into a new position after years of being broken. I looked up then, met his eyes for just a fraction of a second. In that brief moment, I saw not a master, but a frightened man watching his world crumble. And he saw something in me that made him step back. Perhaps he saw the 69 years of rage I had swallowed. Perhaps he saw his own mortality reflected in my aged face. Whatever he glimpsed, it unsettled him. "Clean this up," he muttered, turning away. "And if you break anything else, you'll sleep in the stables with the animals where you belong." I lowered my gaze, murmured the expected, "Yes, master," and knelt carefully to gather the broken glass. My knees pressed into the wine-soaked floor, the liquid seeping into my worn dress. Ruth appeared with a cloth and bucket, her eyes wide with fear for me, but I was not afraid anymore. As I cleaned Master Edmund's mess, as I had cleaned his messes for 69 years, a plan began to form in my mind like a storm gathering on the horizon. It was not a plan born of hasty anger, but of long-accumulated knowledge and careful observation. That evening, after the dishes were washed and the kitchen house cleaned, I walked out to the garden behind the quarters. The moon was rising, full and bright, casting silver light over the herbs and vegetables we were permitted to grow for our own meager meals. But I was not interested in the cabbage or beans. I knelt in the damp earth beside a patch of pokeweed that grew in the shadowed corner, where the fence met the edge of the woods. The plant's purple berries gleamed in the moonlight like dark jewels. Every part of the pokeweed was poisonous, if not prepared correctly, the roots especially. Old Sarah had taught me how to boil them properly to make them safe to eat, but she had also taught me what would happen if they were not boiled long enough, or if too much of the root made its way into a dish. I did not pick the pokeweed that night. I simply sat beside it, my old hands resting on my knees, and thought about the dinner I would serve Master Edmund. I thought about justice and freedom and the price of both. I thought about Ruth and all the young girls who would come after her if nothing changed. I thought about the power that even a servant possessed if she was patient enough, clever enough, desperate enough. The night air smelled of magnolia and coming rain. Somewhere in the quarters, someone was singing softly, a song about crossing over Jordan, about leaving this world of sorrow behind. I listened to that song and felt something I had not felt in 69 long years. I felt powerful. The morning after Master Edmund's outburst, I woke to find bruises blooming on my knees from kneeling on the dining room floor. Purple and yellow, they reminded me of the pokeweed berries I had contemplated in the moonlight. Every movement sent sharp pains through my legs, but I welcomed the discomfort. It kept my mind focused, kept my resolve firm. In the gray hour before dawn, the quarters were silent except for the snoring of exhausted bodies and the occasional cry of a baby, hungry for milk his mother barely had the strength to provide. I dressed slowly, my fingers stiff in the morning chill. April in Georgia could be deceptive, warm in the day, cold enough at night to remind us that winter's grip had not fully released. I made my way to the kitchen house, where the banked coals from yesterday's fire still glowed faintly in the hearth. Ruth was already there, despite the early hour. The girl never seemed to sleep anymore. Dark circles ringed her eyes, and she jumped at every sound. "You're here early, child," I said softly, not wanting to startle her further. She looked up from the kindling she was arranging. "Couldn't sleep, Miss Odelia. Keep having dreams." The way she said the word told me they were nightmares, likely of Thomas Thornfield's pale hands and entitled cruelty. I moved beside her, taking the kindling from her trembling fingers. "Go draw water from the well," I instructed gently. "The morning air will do you good." And Ruth, I waited until she met my eyes. Things don't stay the same forever. Even the seasons change. She nodded slowly, understanding that I was speaking of more than weather, though neither of us could say aloud what we truly meant. The walls had ears on a plantation. Trust was a luxury we could rarely afford, even among ourselves. As Ruth went to fetch water, I stoked the fire back to life and began planning the day's meals. This was my domain, the only place where I held any measure of control. Master Edmund trusted my cooking implicitly, too implicitly. In 69 years, I had never given him reason to doubt me. That trust was a weapon I had spent a lifetime forging without knowing I would one day need to use it. The breakfast preparations followed the familiar routine. Grits simmering with butter, eggs fried in ham drippings, biscuits rising in the Dutch oven. I moved through the tasks with the efficiency of long practice, but my mind was elsewhere, calculating and planning. I knew that whatever action I took would have consequences. The law saw me as property with no rights, no personhood. If Master Edmund fell ill or died after eating my cooking, suspicion would naturally fall on me. The punishment would be swift and brutal, not just for me, but potentially for everyone in the quarters. White folks did not need much excuse to make examples of us, but I also knew that Master Edmund's health had been declining. He drank too much, ate too much, worked himself into rages that left him red-faced and gasping. His heart was weak. I had seen the way he clutched his chest sometimes when he thought no one was watching. If something happened to him, would anyone look beyond the obvious explanation? A man in his 60s, overweight and intemperate, dying suddenly of a heart seizure or stroke was hardly unusual. These thoughts occupied me as I served breakfast to the family. Master Edmund barely acknowledged my presence as I set his plate before him. His wife, Mistress Caroline, picked at her food with the delicate disgust of a woman who had never known hunger. Their daughter, Miss Annabel, had traveled to Charleston to stay with relatives, fleeing the plantation for the relative safety and society of the city. Only Thomas remained, surly and hungover, his eyes following Ruth with a predator's focus whenever she entered the room. "The coffee is cold," Master Edmund complained, though steam still rose from his cup. "I'll bring fresh immediately, master," I replied, lowering my eyes in the expected show of deference. In the kitchen, I poured the coffee he would find acceptable. So hot, it nearly boiled, the way he preferred it, despite how it must have burned his tongue. I wondered idly if he even tasted anything anymore, or if consumption had become merely another way to assert dominance. The morning passed. Lunch was served. The afternoon heat rose, thick and oppressive. Master Edmund retreated to his study to review the plantation accounts, a ledger that listed human beings as assets alongside livestock and equipment. I had seen it once, had seen my own name written there. Odelia, house servant, age 69, value $50. $50, less than the cost of the decanter I had broken. That evening, as I began preparations for dinner, I sent Ruth to the gardens with a list of herbs to gather. "Bring me fresh thyme, rosemary, and sage," I instructed. "And check if the spring onions are ready." When she was gone, I slipped out the back door of the kitchen house and made my way to the shadowed corner where the pokeweed grew. I moved slowly, like an old woman with no particular purpose, just getting a breath of air. If anyone watched from the big house windows, they would see nothing suspicious. The pokeweed stood taller than I remembered from the night before, its thick stems reaching toward the fading sunlight. I did not touch it yet. Instead, I knelt as if to examine the beans growing nearby, pulling a few weeds while my mind worked through the details of what I was contemplating. The root was the most poisonous part. Even a small amount, if consumed without proper preparation, would cause violent sickness, nausea, vomiting, cramping, difficulty breathing. A larger amount could be fatal, especially to someone whose health was already compromised. But pokeweed poisoning could be mistaken for many other ailments. The symptoms resembled cholera, food spoilage, even heart failure in its later stages. I heard footsteps approaching and quickly stood, brushing dirt from my skirt. It was Samuel, one of the field workers, a man of perhaps 40 years whose back bore the raised scars of countless whippings. "Evening, Miss Odelia," he said quietly, his eyes not quite meeting mine. "Overseer sent me to fetch water for the horses." "Well's that way," I replied, gesturing toward the pump. We stood in silence for a moment, two people who had survived decades in this place by being cautious and invisible. "Heard tell Master Edmund was in a powerful rage yesterday," Samuel said carefully. "Heard he might be taking it out on folks today." "Master Edmund's moods are his own business," I replied, the automatic response of someone who had learned never to speak against the master aloud. Samuel nodded slowly, then said something that surprised me. "Old Sarah used to say that everything that grows has a purpose, food or medicine or something else. Said the earth provides what's needed, when it's needed." He looked at me then, directly, and I saw in his eyes that he knew exactly where I was standing and what grew in this shadowed corner. "Old Sarah was a wise woman," I answered quietly. "That she was, and she taught you well." He picked up the water buckets and walked away without another word, but I understood what had passed between us. He would not speak of seeing me here. Perhaps he even understood why I might need the knowledge old Sarah had passed to me. When Ruth returned with the herbs, I began preparing the evening meal. Roasted chicken, root vegetables, bread still warm from the oven. It was a fine meal, the kind that Master Edmund expected every evening despite the shortages that the war had brought to the region. The plantation still had food, because we who produced it often went hungry. As I seasoned the chicken with the herbs Ruth had gathered, I made my decision. Not tonight, not hastily. If I was going to do this thing, it would be done carefully, methodically, in a way that would arouse no suspicion. I would watch and wait for the right moment, would plan every detail. I had survived 69 years by being patient. I could be patient a little longer. But as I served that evening's meal, placing the dishes before Master Edmund with the same invisible efficiency I had practiced for 4 decades, something had fundamentally changed. I was no longer simply enduring. I was planning. I was choosing. Master Edmund ate heartily, complaining about the tenderness of the chicken, even as he devoured it. Mistress Caroline pushed her vegetables around her plate and asked if there was any dessert. Thomas drank too much wine and stared at Ruth with barely concealed intentions. And I served them all, the perfect picture of the submissive servant, while inside my mind worked like a clock, ticking toward a moment that was coming as surely as dawn followed night. That evening, after the dishes were cleaned and the kitchen secured for the night, I walked back to the quarters under a sky full of stars. The April air had cooled, and I could hear frogs singing in the creek beyond the tobacco fields. Ruth walked beside me, silent but present. "Miss Odelia," she whispered when we were far enough from the big house, "thank you for what you said this morning. About things changing." I patted her hand, feeling the calluses already forming on her young palms. "Keep faith, child. Darkness don't last forever. Even the longest night ends." In the quarters, I lay on my narrow cot, my body aching in the way it did every night, and stared up at the ceiling beams barely visible in the darkness. Around me, 20 other people tried to find rest in a space meant for half that number. Someone was crying softly in the corner. A man coughed, the deep rattling sound of lungs damaged by years of field work. This was all I had ever known. This suffering, this injustice, this daily degradation. But somewhere beyond these plantation boundaries, armies were fighting for or against the possibility that people like me might be considered human. And here, in this small corner of Georgia, I was fighting my own war, with the only weapons available to a 69-year-old woman whose hands knew both healing and harm. I thought of the pokeweed growing in the garden's shadow. I thought of Master Edmund's words, "You're just a servant." I thought of Ruth's tears and Samuel's knowing look and all the years that stretched behind me like a road of sorrows. And I began to plan in earnest. 3 days passed before I took the next step. 3 days of watching, listening, observing the patterns that governed life at Thornfield Plantation. Master Edmund's routines were as predictable as the sunrise. He breakfasted at 7, returned to the house for lunch at 1, and expected dinner precisely at 7 in the evening. His appetites were specific, his temper volatile, his sense of absolute authority unshakable. But I noticed other things during those 3 days. The way he clutched his left arm sometimes after climbing the stairs, the shortness of breath that followed his rages, the tremor in his hands when he poured his morning bourbon, which he did earlier and earlier each day. The war was destroying him as surely as it was destroying the Confederacy he supported with such fervor. On the 4th day, a Thursday marked by oppressive humidity that made breathing feel like drowning, everything converged in a way that felt like fate, though I did not believe in fate. I believed in observation and opportunity. Thomas Thornfield cornered Ruth in the pantry again that morning. I heard her cry out, heard his laugh, heard the sounds of a struggle. I arrived quickly enough to interrupt, my presence alone causing him to step back with irritation rather than shame. "We need more flour from the storeroom, Master Thomas," I said, my voice carefully neutral. "If you'll excuse us." He looked at me with cold contempt, a young man who had been raised to believe that people who looked like me existed only for his convenience and pleasure. "You're always interfering, old woman. Perhaps father should send you to the fields where you belong. See how long you last picking cotton at your age." "Perhaps," I replied evenly, though my heart hammered against my ribs. "But then who would cook the meals you enjoy?" He snorted and left, but not before giving Ruth a look that promised this was not finished. When he was gone, I held the girl as she sobbed, feeling the fragility of her young body, the way she shook like a bird caught in a storm. "I can't endure this," she whispered. "Miss Odelia, I can't. I'd rather die than—" "Hush," I said firmly, gripping her shoulders. "You listen to me, Ruth. You will survive this. You are stronger than you know. And this," I gestured toward where Thomas had stood, "this will not continue. I promise you." It was a promise I had no right to make, but I made it anyway. Because in that moment, I knew with absolute certainty what I was going to do. Not just for myself, not just for the memory of my mother who had died in the fields and my father who had been sold away and all the years of my own degradation, but for Ruth and every person who would come after us if nothing changed. That afternoon, Master Edmund sent word that he would be having a special dinner that evening. Confederate Colonel Jameson would be visiting to discuss the war effort and the problem of enslaved people fleeing to Union lines whenever Northern troops came near. Master Edmund wanted an impressive meal, something that would demonstrate that Thornfield Plantation remained prosperous despite the conflict. "Serve the ham we've been saving," Mistress Caroline instructed me. "And make that mushroom sauce Edmund favors. Use the good china and the silver. We must show Colonel Jameson that some of us still maintain civilized standards." "Yes, mistress," I replied, an idea already forming. The mushroom sauce was a dish I had perfected over the years. It required butter, cream, sherry, and wild mushrooms from the woods beyond the plantation. Master Edmund loved it, insisted on it for special occasions. It was rich, complex, and, most importantly, dark in color and strong in flavor, the kind of sauce that could hide other tastes, other ingredients. I sent Ruth to the smokehouse for the ham, then slipped away to the garden while the kitchen was empty. The pokeweed stood waiting, its purple berries gleaming in the afternoon sun. I had thought long and hard about this moment, had considered every possible outcome. If I was caught, I would be tortured and killed. There would be no trial, no justice, no mercy. But had there ever been any mercy shown to us? Had there been trials for the children sold away from their mothers, for the women violated, for the men worked to death in the fields? What justice existed in a system that called human beings property? I knelt beside the pokeweed, my old knees protesting, and carefully dug around the base of one plant. The root came up slowly, thick and pale, looking innocent enough. I broke off a piece about the length of my thumb and wrapped it in my apron, then covered the hole and stood, looking around to ensure no one had witnessed. My hands were steady. That surprised me. I had expected to tremble, to feel fear or uncertainty. Instead, I felt a calm that bordered on peace. This was not murder born of rage or hatred. This was an act of war, as surely as the battles being fought across the South. Master Edmund Thornfield had declared war on my humanity every day of my life. I was simply fighting back with the only weapons available to me. In the kitchen, I washed the root carefully, then began to prepare the mushroom sauce. I chopped the wild mushrooms fine, sautéed them in butter until they released their earthy aroma. I added the cream and sherry, let it simmer and reduce. And then, when Ruth was occupied with setting the dining room table, I grated a small amount of the pokeweed root into the sauce. Not much. Perhaps a tablespoon. Enough to cause severe illness, but unlikely to kill immediately. I wanted Master Edmund to suffer, to feel helpless, to understand what it was like to have no control over what was happening to your body. If he died, it would be because his already compromised heart could not withstand the strain. If he survived, he would be weakened, diminished, perhaps unable to continue his tyranny with the same vigor. The sauce continued to simmer, and I stirred it slowly, watching the pokeweed disappear into the dark mixture. There was no visible evidence of what I had done. The taste would be masked by the strong flavor of the mushrooms and sherry. And who would suspect the loyal servant who had cooked faithfully for 40 years? As the ham roasted and the other dishes came together, I felt a strange detachment, as if I were watching myself from a great distance. This woman with the gray hair and worn hands, this woman who had endured 69 years of bondage, she was capable of this. She was capable of resistance, of action, of choosing her own path, even if that path led to destruction. Ruth returned from the dining room, her eyes still red from earlier tears. "Everything's set, Miss Odelia. The silver's polished and the candles are lit." "Good girl," I said gently. "Now, I need you to do something for me. When dinner is served, I want you to stay in the kitchen. Clean the pots, organize the pantry, whatever you need to do, but don't go back into that dining room. Do you understand?" She looked at me curiously. "But won't you need help serving? I can manage alone tonight. Please, Ruth, trust me on this." Something in my voice must have conveyed the seriousness of my request, because she nodded slowly. "Yes, Miss Odelia, if you say so." Colonel Jameson arrived promptly at 7, a tall man with gray whiskers and a uniform that had seen better days. The Confederacy was losing, and it showed even in the appearance of its officers. Master Edmund greeted him with forced joviality, pouring bourbon with a generous hand. I served the first course, a soup made from the last of the winter squash, and listened to them talk about troop movements, supply shortages, and the betrayal of enslaved people who ran to Union lines seeking freedom. They spoke about us as if we were dogs who had turned on their masters, lacking the intelligence to understand our own interests. "The problem is too much leniency," Colonel Jameson declared. "These people need a firm hand. Any sign of rebellion should be crushed immediately and publicly. Make examples of the troublemakers, and the rest will fall in line." Master Edmund nodded agreement. "I've never hesitated to discipline my property. They understand that I am master here." I stood against the wall, invisible in my servitude, and felt the weight of the serving tray in my hands. How easy it would be to swing it, to strike them both down while they sat congratulating themselves on their cruelty. But that was not my plan. My plan required patience. I brought out the ham, glazed and glistening, and placed it before Master Edmund to carve. I brought the roasted vegetables, the fresh bread, the corn pudding, and finally, I brought the mushroom sauce in a silver gravy boat, setting it beside Master Edmund's plate. "Ah, the mushroom sauce," he exclaimed. "Odelia makes it better than anyone. You must try it, Colonel. It's extraordinary." "I'm sure it is," the Colonel replied, accepting the serving I placed before him. But I had been careful. I had prepared 2 pots of sauce, side by side. One contained the pokeweed root, the other was perfectly safe. Colonel Jameson received the safe sauce. Mistress Caroline, whose plate I filled next, received the safe sauce. Even Thomas, though I despised him, received the safe sauce. Only Master Edmund's serving came from the tainted pot. Only the man who had called me property, who had worked my mother to death, who had created an environment where young girls like Ruth were prey, only he received what he deserved. He poured the sauce liberally over his ham and vegetables, just as I knew he would. He took his first bite, chewed, swallowed. "Excellent as always, Odelia," he said dismissively, already returning his attention to the colonel. I stood and watched him eat. 3 bites, 4, 5. He consumed the sauce with the same thoughtless entitlement he consumed everything else. My heart beat steadily in my chest. My expression remained neutral, the mask I had worn for 69 years firmly in place. "You may clear the soup bowls," Mistress Caroline said, and I moved to comply, gathering the dishes with practiced efficiency. In the kitchen, Ruth looked at me with concern. "Miss Odelia, are you feeling well? You look different somehow." "I'm fine, child. Just tired. It's been a long day." I returned to the dining room to clear the main course, and as I reached for Master Edmund's plate, I noticed him pause mid-sentence. His hand went to his stomach, and his face had taken on a grayish tinge. "Edmund?" Mistress Caroline's voice held a note of concern. "Are you unwell?" "Just indigestion," he muttered. "Too rich, perhaps." "Continue, Colonel. You were saying about the ammunition supplies?" But 5 minutes later, he could not continue the pretense. Sweat had broken out on his forehead, and he had gone from gray to a pale green that reminded me of pond water. "Caroline, I need to..." He stood abruptly, swaying, gripping the table for balance. "Fetch the doctor," he gasped. Something is wrong." Mistress Caroline screamed for Thomas, and suddenly the dining room erupted in chaos. Master Edmund collapsed back into his chair, clutching his stomach, his breath coming in short gasps. Vomit rose in his throat, and he barely managed to turn aside before it came. I stood frozen, the serving tray still in my hands, my face arranged in an expression of shock and concern. Inside, I felt nothing. No satisfaction, no horror, no regret. Just a vast emptiness where 69 years of suppressed rage had finally found release. "Odelia!" Mistress Caroline shrieked. "Don't just stand there! Help him!" I set down the tray and moved forward, playing my role. "Should I fetch water, mistress? Call for the doctor?" Yes, hurry!" I left the room with appropriate haste, but my pace was measured. The doctor lived 5 miles away. By the time he arrived, Master Edmund would be deep in the throes of pokeweed poisoning, and everyone would assume it was his heart, or spoiled food, or any of a dozen other explanations. Because who would suspect the faithful servant? In the kitchen, Ruth stared at me with wide eyes as the commotion echoed from the dining room. "Miss Odelia, what's happening?" "Master Edmund has taken ill," I said calmly, putting on my shawl. "I'm going for the doctor. Keep the fire burning and the water hot. They may need it." I walked out into the April night where the stars watched in silence and the frogs sang their ancient songs. My pace was steady, unhurried, an old woman on an errand, nothing more. And as I walked, I whispered a prayer to a God I was not sure existed anymore, a God who had seemed absent from the suffering of my people. But if he was there, if he listened, I asked not for forgiveness, but for strength, for the courage to face whatever came next, because I knew this night had changed everything, and there would be no going back. I returned with Dr. Harrison nearly an hour later. The doctor was a thin, weary man in his 50s who had been tending to the Thornfield family for 20 years. He had set Thomas's broken arm when the boy fell from a horse, had delivered Mistress Caroline's stillborn second child, had treated Master Edmund's gout and his periodic attacks of what he called nervous complaints. He climbed down from his buggy with the resignation of a man called away from his dinner too many times to count. The scene in the big house was exactly as I had anticipated. Master Edmund had been moved to his bedroom, where he lay in his 4-poster bed, a bed built by enslaved hands, moaning and writhing in agony. His skin had taken on a waxy appearance, and the smell of vomit and human waste permeated the room despite the windows being thrown open. Mistress Caroline hovered nearby, wringing her hands and demanding that the doctor do something immediately. I stood in the doorway, awaiting instructions, my face arranged in appropriate concern. Inside, I felt the same strange calm that had possessed me since I had made my decision. This was happening. The thing I had planned was unfolding exactly as I had foreseen. Dr. Harrison examined Master Edmund with professional detachment, taking his pulse, listening to his heart, checking his pupils. "How long has he been like this?" he asked. "It started during dinner," Mistress Caroline said, her voice trembling. Perhaps half an hour after we began eating, he complained of stomach pain, and then it became worse very rapidly. What did he eat? Ham, vegetables, bread, the same as we all ate. The doctor turned to me. "Odelia, you prepared the meal?" "Yes, sir," I replied quietly, meeting his eyes briefly before lowering my gaze in the expected show of deference. "Was there anything unusual about the food? Anything that seemed spoiled or off?" "No, sir. Everything was fresh. I prepared it the same way I always do." This was not a lie. I had prepared everything exactly as I always did, with one small addition that no one would think to look for. Dr. Harrison returned his attention to Master Edmund, who was now dry-heaving, his body trying to purge itself of poison it could not identify. "It appears to be acute gastroenteritis," the doctor pronounced. "Possibly from spoiled meat, though it's unusual for it to affect only one person if you all ate from the same ham." Edmund took the mushroom sauce, Colonel Jameson offered from where he stood near the window, keeping his distance from the sick room. "The rest of us had only a little, but he loves that sauce. He had quite a lot of it." My heart stuttered for a moment. This was dangerous territory. If they focused on the sauce, if they examined what remained of it too closely. But no, I had been thorough. I had already disposed of the tainted pot, cleaning it and setting it with the other kitchen equipment. There was no evidence remaining. "Mushrooms," Dr. Harrison mused. "Were they wild mushrooms, Odelia?" "Yes, sir. From the woods, same as always. I've been gathering them from the same place for 40 years. I know which ones are safe. Nevertheless, mushrooms can be tricky. Even experienced foragers can make mistakes, particularly if the mushrooms are past their prime or have been contaminated by toxic varieties growing nearby." He was giving me an explanation, a reason for what had happened that absolved everyone of blame. I was being offered a way out, a narrative that made this a tragic accident rather than deliberate action. All I had to do was accept it. "I suppose it's possible, sir," I said slowly, allowing doubt to creep into my voice. Though I was careful, as always. But these old eyes, I trailed off meaningfully. "There, you see." Dr. Harrison turned to Mistress Caroline. "An unfortunate accident, but these things happen. The good news is that if it is mushroom poisoning of the sort that causes gastrointestinal distress, it's unpleasant but rarely fatal. The body will purge itself of the toxin over the next day or two." "But he looks terrible," Mistress Caroline protested. "He's quite ill, certainly, but I believe he'll recover. I'll leave you some laudanum to ease his pain and help him rest. Make sure he drinks water when he can keep it down. The greatest danger is dehydration." Master Edmund groaned from the bed, his eyes squeezed shut against the cramping pain in his gut. I watched him suffer and felt nothing. No guilt, no satisfaction, just the sense that something that should have happened long ago was finally occurring. Over the next 3 days, I tended to Master Edmund's sickness with the same efficiency I had brought to all my duties. I changed his soiled bedding, brought him water he could not keep down, prepared broth that came back up as quickly as it went in. I performed these tasks because they were expected of me, and because any deviation from my normal behavior would raise suspicion. But I also performed them because I wanted to witness what I had done. I wanted to see Master Edmund Thornfield, who had called me property and treated me as less than human, reduced to a helpless creature dependent on my care. The irony was not lost on me. He had spent his life asserting that he was superior, that I existed only to serve him. Now his very survival depended on my willingness to tend him through an illness I had caused. Ruth helped me with the nursing duties, though she had to leave the room several times to vomit herself. The girl had a weak stomach for such things. On the second day, as we stripped the bed for the 3rd time that morning, she whispered to me, "Miss Odelia, do you think Master Edmund will die?" "That's for God to decide, child," I replied neutrally. "If he dies, what will happen to us? Will Miss Caroline sell the plantation? Will we be split up and sold to different places?" These were legitimate concerns. The war had destabilized everything. Plantations were failing, enslaved people were being sold or moved to prevent them from running to Union lines. Families were being separated with even less consideration than usual. Our future hung in a balance more precarious than it had ever been. "We can't know what's coming," I said finally. "We can only endure what is and hope for better." But privately, I had thought about this. If Master Edmund died, the plantation would pass to Thomas, and that might be even worse than the current situation. Thomas had his father's cruelty without the tempering effect of age and social obligation. He would be a terror. On the 3rd day, Master Edmund's fever broke. His vomiting slowed, then stopped. He began to take sips of water without immediately purging them. Dr. Harrison, on his return visit, pronounced him out of danger, though gravely weakened. "You'll need to convalesce for at least 2 weeks, the doctor instructed. "No rich foods, no alcohol, no exertion." "You'll need to convalesce for at least 2 weeks, the doctor instructed. "No rich foods, No alcohol, no exertion. Your heart has been under tremendous strain. Another episode like this could kill you. Master Edmund nodded weakly from his pillows, too exhausted to protest. He looked diminished somehow, as if the illness had stripped away not just his physical strength, but some essential quality that had made him formidable. His skin hung loose on his frame, his eyes had sunk deep into his skull, and his hands trembled when he tried to lift them. I stood near the door, hands folded, waiting to be told what was needed. When Dr. Harrison left, Mistress Carolyn turned to me with an expression that was difficult to read. "Odelia," she said slowly, "the doctor says those mushrooms nearly killed my husband." My heart beat faster, but I kept my face carefully neutral. "Yes, mistress, I'm deeply sorry. I've never had such a thing happen in all my years of cooking." "No, you haven't." She studied me for a long moment, and I wondered if she saw something in my face, some flicker of the truth, but then she looked away. "You're getting old, Odelia. Your eyes aren't what they were. Perhaps it's time we had Ruth take over more of the cooking responsibilities. You can supervise, but the actual preparation should fall to younger hands." It was a demotion, a public acknowledgement that I was no longer fully trusted. But it was not an accusation, and more importantly, it was not a death sentence. I bowed my head. "As you wish, mistress. I'll train Ruth properly." Over the following days, as Master Edmund slowly regained his strength, life on the plantation began to shift in subtle ways. The master's illness had exposed the fragility of the system that governed us. Without his constant presence, his immediate authority, things loosened slightly. The overseer still patrolled the fields with his whip, but there was less enthusiasm in his brutality. Thomas tried to assert himself as the man of the house, but he lacked his father's force of personality, and everyone knew it was temporary. Ruth and I worked side by side in the kitchen, and I taught her everything I knew, not just about cooking, but about the herbs and plants that grew around us. Which ones healed, which ones harmed, which ones could be used for purposes that had nothing to do with food. She was a quick learner, her young mind absorbing information with the hunger of someone who understood that knowledge was power. "Why are you teaching me this?" she asked one evening as we cleaned the kitchen after dinner. "These things about the plants that make people sick?" I looked at her carefully, weighing how much truth to share. "Because knowledge is survival, child. The world is changing. The war will end eventually, one way or another. And when it does, we'll need to know how to protect ourselves, how to choose our own paths. Understanding what grows around us, what it can do, that's a kind of power that no one can take away." She nodded slowly, understanding more than I had said aloud. "Did you—" she began, then stopped, fear crossing her face. "Hush," I said gently but firmly. "Some questions are better left unasked. Some things are better left unknown. Do you understand?" "Yes, Miss Odelia, I understand." Master Edmund remained bedridden for 2 weeks, just as the doctor had ordered. When he finally rose and made his way downstairs, leaning heavily on a cane, he was a changed man. The illness had aged him 10 years. His voice, once so commanding, came out thin and reedy. His hands shook, and he tired easily. Most significantly, his rages seemed to have burned out. He no longer had the energy for them. He looked at me differently now, too. There was something in his eyes when I served his meals, something that might have been suspicion, or fear, or perhaps just the awareness of his own mortality. He no longer shouted at me or berated me for small imperfections. He barely spoke to me at all. Thomas noticed the change in his father and tried to fill the void of authority, but he overreached. One afternoon, I heard him shouting at Samuel in the yard, threatening him with a whipping for some minor infraction. Before he could follow through, Master Edmund's voice called weakly from the house. "Thomas, leave the man alone. We need every hand for the planting." It was a practical concern, not a moral one, but it was enough to stop Thomas. The young master glared at me as if I were somehow responsible for his humiliation, then stalked away. I knew I had made an enemy, but Thomas had always been an enemy. At least now he was a contained one. News from the war continued to filter into the plantation, each report more dire than the last for the Confederacy. General Lee's army was being pushed back. Sherman had cut a swath through Georgia. The Union was winning, slowly but inexorably. Hope began to spread through the quarters, like dawn spreading across the fields. People whispered about freedom, about what they would do when the chains finally broke. I listened to these whispers, but remained cautious. I had seen too much to trust in hope. Freedom would come with its own challenges, its own dangers. Master Edmund and his kind would not surrender their power gracefully. There would be violence, retaliation, new forms of oppression to replace the old ones. But still, something had changed. I had changed. For 69 years I had endured, survived, submitted. I had played the role assigned to me with such perfection that I had almost forgotten it was a role. But that night when I served Master Edmund the mushroom sauce, when I made the choice to act rather than simply endure, I had broken something inside myself, or perhaps I had finally put something back together that had been shattered long ago. I was no longer just a servant, just property, just a nameless woman with no agency. I was Odelia Harrow, and I had chosen my own action. I had risked everything for a moment of justice, or revenge, or whatever name one wanted to give to resistance, and I had survived it. One evening, about a month after Master Edmund's illness, I sat outside the quarters watching the sun set behind the trees. Samuel approached and sat down beside me, keeping a respectful distance but making his presence known. "Heard tell the Union troops are less than 50 miles away," he said quietly. "Maybe 2 weeks before they reach this area." "That's so?" I replied noncommittally. "When they come, things are going to get dangerous. Master Edmund and the others, they're not going to just let us walk away. There'll be trouble. There's always trouble." Samuel was quiet for a moment, then said, "Whatever you did that night, Miss Odelia, and I'm not saying I know what you did or didn't do, it gave us something. Hope, maybe. Or just the knowledge that we're not as powerless as they want us to believe." I turned to look at him, this man whose back bore the scars of his resistance, whose eyes held the weariness of 4 decades of bondage. "We do what we must to survive," I said simply. "And sometimes survival means fighting back in whatever ways we can." "Yes, ma'am. That it does." We sat in silence as darkness fell, 2 people who had endured the unendurable and lived to see the possibility of change. The night air smelled of growing things, of earth and life, and the promise of something beyond the boundaries we had always known. Inside the quarters, someone began to sing. It was the same song I had heard the night I decided to act, the song about crossing over Jordan. But tonight, it sounded different, less like a prayer for death's release and more like an anthem of approaching freedom. I closed my eyes and listened, letting the music wash over me. My body ached with 69 years of labor, but my spirit felt lighter than it had in decades. Whatever came next, freedom or continued bondage, life or death, I would face it as a woman who had chosen her own path, who had struck back at her oppressor, who had refused to simply endure. Master Edmund Thornfield had called me just a servant, but I had proven, at least to myself, that I was so much more than that. I was a survivor, a fighter, a woman with the knowledge and courage to claim what small measure of justice was available to me. And that, perhaps, was its own kind of freedom. May arrived with unseasonable heat and the sound of distant thunder. Though whether it was weather or artillery fire, no one could say for certain. The plantation existed in a strange state of suspended animation, everyone waiting for something to break. Master Edmund remained weak, confined mostly to his study, going through the motions of managing the plantation, but lacking the vigor to truly control it. Thomas attempted to assert authority, but succeeded only in creating resentment. Mistress Caroline spent her days writing anxious letters to her daughter in Charleston and receiving increasingly alarming replies. The enslaved people in the quarters felt the shift in power like animals sensing an approaching storm. Conversations that would have been unthinkable a month ago now happened in quiet corners. Plans were whispered, possibilities discussed. If the Union troops came, should we run to meet them? Should we stay and claim the land we had worked our entire lives? Should we arm ourselves against the inevitable white violence that would come when their world collapsed? I listened more than I spoke. At 69, I was too old to run, too tired to fight in any conventional sense. But I had proven to myself that there were other forms of resistance, other ways to strike back. And I had information that the younger people did not. Knowledge passed down from old Sarah. Understanding of plants and remedies and poisons that could be useful in the uncertain times ahead. Ruth had blossomed under my teaching. The frightened girl who had cowered in corners had developed a core of steel. She worked efficiently, spoke quietly, and observed everything with sharp intelligence. She had also begun teaching other young women in the quarters what I had taught her: how to identify healing herbs, how to treat wounds and illness, how to recognize which plants should never be consumed and which could serve purposes beyond food. "You're creating dangerous knowledge," I warned her one afternoon as we prepared the midday meal. "Yes," she replied simply. "Dangerous to them, maybe, but life-saving for us." She had understood what I was really doing when I taught her these things. Perhaps she had even guessed the truth about Master Edmund's illness, though she was too wise to say so aloud. We worked in companionable silence, 2 women separated by 53 years, but united in our determination to survive whatever was coming. The first week of May brought a visitor who changed everything. A rider arrived at dawn, his horse lathered with sweat, his uniform torn and stained. He was a Confederate officer, though officer seemed too grand a word for the exhausted young man who could barely dismount without assistance. I brought him water while Master Edmund was roused from his bed to receive the news. I was not supposed to hear their conversation, but the windows of the study were open against the heat, and I stood just outside, ostensibly sweeping the porch while I listened to every word. Sherman's forces are advancing faster than anticipated, the young officer reported. They'll be in this county within a week, possibly less. I'm authorized to tell you to prepare for the worst. Hide your valuables, secure your property, and arm yourself if possible. There will be no reinforcements. The Confederacy cannot defend every plantation. Master Edmund's voice, when he replied, sounded like dry leaves rustling. And after? When the Yankees have passed through? What then? That depends on how the war ends, sir. But between us, it's not looking favorable. General Lee cannot hold out much longer. The question is not whether we lose, but when. After the officer left, fortified with food and a fresh horse, the plantation descended into barely controlled chaos. Master Edmund called Thomas and the overseer into the study for a long consultation. Mistress Caroline began directing the house servants to pack the family silver, the good china, anything of value that could be hidden or transported. In the quarters, the news spread like wildfire. Union troops within a week. The reaction was mixed. Hope warred with terror, because we all knew that the period of transition would be the most dangerous. White people facing the collapse of their world would be unpredictable and violent. Some enslaved people would be killed simply for being witnesses to their master's humiliation. Some would be killed to prevent them from claiming freedom. Some would be killed for no reason at all, except rage and fear. That evening, Samuel organized a secret meeting in the woods beyond the tobacco fields. Nearly 40 people gathered, mostly men, but some women too, speaking in urgent whispers about what to do. We should run now, one young man argued. Meet the Union troops halfway. Get away from this place before Master Edmund and Thomas decide to do something desperate. And go where? An older woman countered. At least here we know the land, know where food is, where we can shelter. Out there, we'd be refugees with nothing. We should stay and fight, another man said, his voice hard with long suppressed anger. Take what's ours, this land, these buildings, we built them with our own hands. Why should we run? Samuel held up his hands for quiet. Fighting means dying. They still have guns, and we don't. We need to be smart about this. Maybe some of us run, some of us stay. Spread out our chances. I had not planned to speak, but I found myself stepping forward. 40 pairs of eyes turned to me. This old woman who had survived 69 years when so many had not. Whatever we decide, I said slowly, we need to be ready for violence. Master Edmund is weak now, but Thomas isn't. The overseer isn't. They'll try to maintain control right up until the moment they can't, and then they'll lash out. We need to protect ourselves, especially the young people and the children. How? Ruth asked from beside me. We have no weapons. We have knowledge, I replied. We have the land itself. We know this plantation better than they ever will. We know which buildings can be barricaded, which paths through the woods lead to safety, which plants can help us, and which can hurt our enemies if necessary. I saw understanding dawn in several faces. They knew what I was suggesting, even if I was not saying it explicitly. The same knowledge that had laid Master Edmund low could be used to protect us if things became desperate. I'm too old to run, I continued. But I'm not too old to teach. Anyone who wants to learn what old Sarah taught me, come to the kitchen tomorrow before dawn. I'll show you what you need to know. The meeting dispersed shortly after, people drifting back to the quarters in small groups so as not to attract attention. Ruth walked beside me, her hand finding mine in the darkness. Are you sure about this, Miss Odelia? She whispered. Teaching them those things. If anyone finds out. Child, we're past worrying about being caught. The world is ending. Their world anyway. Ours might just be beginning. But we have to survive the transition, and that means being prepared for anything. The next morning, 12 people came to the kitchen before dawn. I taught them quickly and efficiently, showing them which plants to gather, how to prepare them, how to store them safely. I taught them which mushrooms caused illness and which caused death. I taught them which berries could induce vomiting or diarrhea, which roots could cause paralysis, which leaves could be brewed into teas that would make a person sleep so deeply they might never wake. This is not about revenge, I told them firmly. This is about survival. If they come for us with violence, we need ways to defend ourselves beyond fighting with our bare hands. But use this knowledge carefully. Once you strike, there's no taking it back. They nodded, these young and middle-aged people who were learning that even the powerless had power if they knew where to look for it. Ruth assisted me, her knowledge now almost equal to my own, her confidence growing with each passing day. By mid-morning, the teaching was done, and I sent them all away to their regular duties before anyone noticed their absence. Ruth and I began preparing breakfast for the big house, moving through the familiar routine while my mind turned over all the possibilities of what might happen in the coming days. Master Edmund came down to breakfast, leaning on his cane, his face gray with fatigue and worry. He barely touched his food, pushing the eggs around his plate with a fork that trembled in his hand. The world is changing, Odelia, he said suddenly, startling me. He had not addressed me directly in weeks. Yes, master, I replied carefully, unsure where this was leading. Everything I built, everything my father built, it's all going to disappear. Those Yankees are going to come through here and destroy it all. He looked up at me then, and I saw something unexpected in his eyes. Not quite recognition of my humanity, but perhaps acknowledgement of my presence as something more than a piece of furniture. The war has been hard on everyone, master, I said neutrally. You think you'll be better off when they free you, he continued, as if I had not spoken. You think freedom will solve everything, but you don't understand how the world works. Without us to provide for you, to organize your labor, you'll be helpless. You need us. I could have laughed at his delusion, but I kept my face blank. Perhaps, master. I've never been cruel to you, Odelia. I've provided for you, given you shelter and food and purpose for 69 years. You understand that, don't you? I looked at this man who had owned me since I was born, who had never questioned his right to my labor or my life, who had called me property and treated me as less than human, and who now wanted me to thank him for my enslavement. I understand many things, master, I replied quietly. More than you might think. Something in my tone made him look at me sharply, but then Thomas entered the dining room and the moment passed. I cleared the plates and returned to the kitchen, where Ruth was washing dishes with unnecessary vigor. Did you hear him? She hissed. Talking about how he's never been cruel, how he's provided for us, as if we should be grateful. Hush, I cautioned, though I understood her anger. Save your strength for what's coming. His opinion doesn't matter anymore. Nothing he thinks matters. In a week, maybe less, none of this will exist the way it does now. And what will we do then, Miss Odelia? When we're free but have nothing? I smiled, the first genuine smile I had allowed myself in weeks. We'll do what we've always done, child. We'll survive. We'll endure. And maybe finally, we'll live. The Union troops arrived on May 14, 1863, exactly 6 days after the Confederate officer's warning. I was in the garden when I heard the sound of approaching horses, many horses, accompanied by the rhythmic tramp of marching feet. The sound came from the main road, growing louder with each passing moment, inevitable as a storm that had been gathering on the horizon for years. I straightened slowly, my hand resting on the small of my aching back, and watched as blue uniforms appeared through the trees. There must have been 200 soldiers, maybe more, a column that seemed to stretch endlessly down the road. At their head rode an officer with silver hair and a face that had seen too many battles. They marched with the confidence of an army that knew it was winning. In the big house, I heard Mistress Caroline scream. Master Edmund emerged onto the porch, leaning heavily on his cane, Thomas beside him with a rifle he barely knew how to use. The overseer had disappeared the night before, fleeing to avoid confronting the consequences of his years of cruelty. The officer halted his horse at the edge of the yard and surveyed the plantation with experienced eyes. He took in the big house with its white columns, the outbuildings, the fields stretching into the distance, and the black faces appearing in doorways and around corners, 40-some souls who had waited their entire lives for this moment. I am Colonel Robert Hayes of the Union Army, he announced, his voice carrying across the yard. As of this moment, this plantation is under military authority. All persons previously held in bondage are hereby declared free under the provisions of the Emancipation Proclamation. You are no longer property. You are free to go or stay as you choose, and any attempt to prevent your freedom will be met with the full force of Union military law. The words hung in the air like a spell. Free. We were free. I had lived 69 years as a slave, and in a single sentence, that reality had ended. It seemed impossible, too simple, as if something so monumental should require more ceremony or struggle or acknowledgement. Around me, people began to react. Some cried. Some stood frozen in disbelief. Some started walking, just walking in any direction, away from the places they had been forced to labor. Young Thomas raised his rifle, his face contorted with rage. But before he could do anything foolish, 2 Union soldiers had dismounted and disarmed him with efficient brutality. Master Edmund said nothing. He simply stood on his porch, watching his world dissolve, and I saw in his face the complete destruction of everything he had believed about himself and his place in the universe. Colonel Hayes dismounted and approached the house, gesturing for his men to search the outbuildings. We'll be requisitioning supplies, he informed Master Edmund. Food, livestock, anything useful to the war effort. I suggest you cooperate fully. This is my property, Master Edmund said, but his voice had no strength behind it. You have no right. The only rights that matter now are federal rights, the colonel interrupted. And the United States government has determined that slavery is ended and that resources may be taken from those who supported the rebellion. Consider yourself fortunate that we're not burning this place to the ground. I watched this exchange with a strange detachment. Part of me wanted to feel triumph, to see Master Edmund's humiliation as justice finally served. But mostly, I just felt tired. 69 years tired. Tired in my bones and my spirit and my very soul. Ruth appeared at my elbow, her eyes wide with wonder and fear. Miss Odelia, we're free. What do we do now? It was the question everyone was asking, spoken or unspoken. Freedom had arrived, but it came with no instructions, no resources, no plan. We were free to go, but where? Free to claim our own lives, but with what means? Free to work for wages, but who would hire us and what would they pay? Over the next 3 days, the plantation transformed into something unrecognizable. The Union troops made camp in the fields, their tents springing up like mushrooms after rain. They slaughtered Master Edmund's livestock for their own provisions, took the stored grain and preserved food, helped themselves to anything they deemed useful. Master Edmund and his family were confined to a few rooms in the big house, powerless witnesses to the dismantling of their empire. Many of the younger enslaved people left immediately, heading toward the Union lines or the promise of cities where opportunity might exist. Samuel departed on the second day, tears streaming down his face as he embraced those of us who were staying. I'm going to find my wife, he told me. She was sold to Alabama 10 years ago. I'm going to walk every mile of this country until I find her. I held him tightly. This man who had survived so much. Go with strength, I whispered. Live the life that was stolen from you. Others stayed, having nowhere else to go and no resources to start over. The plantation might have been the site of our oppression, but it was also familiar, and the world beyond its boundaries was uncertain and potentially hostile. Colonel Hayes offered wages to anyone who would continue working the fields, actual wages paid in Union scrip. It was not much, but it was more than we had ever received before. I stayed because I was 69 years old and had no family to search for, no place to return to, no strength for the journey even if I had. But I stayed on my own terms. When Mistress Caroline called for me to prepare dinner that first evening, I looked at her and said simply, no. Her face went white with shock. In 69 years, I had never refused a direct order. What did you say? I said no, mistress. Or rather, just Caroline, I suppose, since you're not my mistress anymore. I'm too old and too tired to cook for you. You have hands. You can cook for yourself. I expected rage or perhaps tears, but instead, she just crumpled, sat down in a chair and stared at me as if I were a stranger. I don't know how, she whispered. I've never cooked a meal in my life. Then I suppose you'll learn, I replied without sympathy. The way we all learned, by doing what was necessary to survive. I turned and walked away from her, out of the big house I had served in for 40 years, and I did not look back. Ruth followed me, and together we went to the kitchen house that had been our workplace and claimed it as our own. We can use this space, I told her, not to serve them, but to feed ourselves and anyone else who needs it. We have the skills, the knowledge. We can make this work. But the supplies, Ruth began. The Union troops brought plenty of food. They're willing to share with freed people who are willing to work. We cook for them instead of for the thornfields. We earn our wages honestly, and we answer to no one but ourselves. It was a simple plan, but it was our plan. For the first time in my life, I was making decisions about my own labor, my own time, my own existence. That evening, as the sun set on our 4th day of freedom, I walked through the plantation. No, the former plantation, and saw the changes everywhere. The cotton fields stood untended, already beginning to succumb to weeds. The big house looked diminished somehow, less impressive without the forced labor that had maintained its grandeur. The quarters had emptied by half, those remaining beginning to spread out, claiming more space, more privacy, more of the simple dignities that had been denied us. I found myself standing outside Master Edmund's study window. Through the glass, I could see him sitting at his desk, the ledger open before him. The ledger that had listed me as property worth $50. He was crying silently, tears running down his face as he stared at the numbers that no longer meant anything. I felt no satisfaction at his tears, but no sympathy either. He was mourning the loss of his power, his status, his ability to own other human beings. I could not pity him for that. Let him cry for his lost world. I would not shed a single tear for its passing. Instead, I walked to the garden where the pokeweed grew in its shadowed corner. I knelt beside it, my old knees protesting, and looked at the plant that had been my weapon, my means of resistance, my declaration that I would not simply endure forever. Thank you, I whispered to the earth, to old Sarah's memory, to the generations of knowledge that had been passed down through desperate hands and whispered words. Thank you for giving me the power to fight back. Ruth found me there as full darkness fell. She sat beside me in comfortable silence, this young woman who would live the free life I had been denied. Finally, she spoke. Miss Odelia, what you did to Master Edmund, I understand now. I don't know if it was right or wrong, but I understand why you did it. I turned to look at her. What I did doesn't matter anymore. That was a slave's resistance. Now we're free, and we have to learn different ways to fight, different ways to protect ourselves and build our lives. Will you teach me? Child, I've been teaching you all along. You're ready. You're stronger than you know. We sat together as the stars emerged, two women separated by age and experience, but united by our survival. Around us, the sounds of the changing world continued. Union soldiers laughing around their campfires, freed people singing songs that were no longer coded messages, but open celebrations, the night birds calling in the woods beyond the fields. I thought about my mother, dead in these fields at 37. I thought about my father, sold away before I could remember his face. I thought about all the people who had not survived to see this day, all the dreams that had died in the darkness of slavery. They had not lived to be free, but I had. Against all odds, I had survived to see the chains broken. Miss Odelia, Ruth asked quietly, are you happy? Now that we're free? I considered the question carefully. Was I happy? I was too old for happiness, perhaps. Too scarred by 69 years of brutality and degradation. Freedom could not undo what had been done to me, could not give me back the years that had been stolen. But I was satisfied. I had resisted. I had fought back in the only way available to me. I had survived. And now, finally, I was free to live what remained of my life on my own terms, however few years that might be. I'm not sure I know what happiness is, child, I replied honestly. But I know what this is. This is justice, however delayed and imperfect. This is survival. This is victory of a kind. I stood slowly, my body protesting every movement, and looked back toward the quarters where Ruth and I would sleep that night, not as slaves, but as free women. Tomorrow we would begin the complicated work of building lives in freedom. We would face new challenges, new forms of oppression, new struggles. The end of slavery did not mean the end of racism or inequality. I knew that. We all knew that. But tonight, we were free. And I, Odelia Harrow, 69 years old, had lived to see it. I had resisted. I had fought. I had survived. And that, perhaps, was enough. End.